Good evening and welcome to our FreeStyle Libre webinar on understanding exercise using the FreeStyle Libre system. We would like to thank you for joining and hope you find all the information presented useful and informative. Now on to today's webinar. We have two fantastic speakers for you to listen to today to help provide you a practical guide to exercising with diabetes and how you can use the FreeStyle Libre system to help. During the webinar, you will first hear from Dr. Ian Gallen, CBE, who will talk you through the principles of doing exercise with diabetes and how you can manage your diabetes efficiently. This will be followed by Melanie Stevenson, who is a professional athlete. She understands the limitations of exercising with diabetes, but this has by no means stopped her achieve amazing results in her sport. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time for questions for both Mel and Dr. Gallen. You can ask a question by typing it into the chat window in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible, but we'll leave these until the Q&A session so we don't interrupt the presentations. Please note that we are not able to answer clinical or individual healthcare questions during this webinar. You should contact your healthcare team if you do have any specific clinical questions. Following the webinar, we will email a questionnaire to everyone for feedback on how you found today. We really value your feedback and it helps shape the future of the Hopefully, by the end of today's session, you will be better placed to manage your diabetes during exercise. Now let me pass over to Dr. Gallen to take you through his slides.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining the webinar. We're going to cover an area that's very important to people with diabetes and an area of some concern to healthcare professionals about how to advise patients. When I was a medical registrar working in Nottingham, I remember being advised when people were asked about how to manage their diabetes was to take a mini Mars bar. I don't understand where that came from, but it's clearly not correct. And what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to go through some of the principles of the changes seen with patients with type 1 diabetes and insulin therapy during exercise. So my experience in this is that in about 1997, Stephen Redgrave, came to see me to manage his diabetes in sport. He was newly diagnosed with diabetes and he'd been advised that his career was ended. I was fortunate in that I'd had some higher training in physiology and also done some work on the new analog insulin. And Stephen was an extraordinarily able athlete, so we knew what he could do. And with his intense input and that from his wife, Anne Redgrave, we were able to establish a method of managing diabetes at the very highest level. And as a result, people came to see me to manage their diabetes, and that's where my experience has come from. So what do we find when people come to talk to us with type 1 diabetes? What do they complain of? Well, the most usual pattern is falling blood glucose during some types of exercise and sometimes hypoglycemia. But for other people, they find rising blood glucose, and many patients think that this is inexplicable and there's something wrong with their bodies, that blood glucoses fall during some exercise and rise with others, and they must be doing something wrong. And even more perplexing, sometimes they do exercise and find there's very little change in the blood glucose. For all people with type 1 diabetes, it's difficult to control diabetes after exercise, immediately after exercise and in the hours afterwards. And for many, suffer hypoglycemia at night. And this can be so upsetting that it discourages people from carrying on exercise at all. If you have a severe hypo after doing a long cycle ride with having your spouse or partner call the paramedics, it really is very distressing. I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on this very useful slide made by my friend and colleague Mike Riddell in Toronto. I had done a similar sort of slide, but his one is much better than mine, and so I'm using it. So this graph shows the top panel, a schema of different work levels of different forms of exercise. So we start on the upper left-hand side, the workload of continuous aerobic exercise, such as you might see during running or swimming or cycling. The other panel at the very far end, on the right-hand side, is intense anaerobic exercise, such as you might see during sprint sports, climbing, grappling. In the middle panels, we see the sort of exercise that most people do, which is intermittent intensity exercise with some higher and some lower intensity exercise over a more prolonged period of time. And the first one would be moderate vigorous, and the second would be the sort of exercise you would see in a gym where you're lifting weights, or you're doing a spin class. Now, moving down, I want you to pay attention to the glucose trend in people who don't have diabetes. And you can see for the first 3 panels, the blood glucose remains remarkably constant. Sorry, so it's just remarkably constant. And if you have an exercise like Ironman triathlon, where you're doing exercise over many hours, people's blood glucose hardly changes at all. But if you look at the very farthest panel, in the anaerobic exercise for people without diabetes, you can see that even for people without diabetes, there's a spike in blood glucose. It corrects quite quickly, but people without diabetes do get a bit of hyperglycemia with sprint sports. Now, I want you to move on to the lower panel, which is the glucose trend in type 1 diabetes. And this is the easiest to understand. We see a typically falling blood glucose. And it's important that even raising blood glucose to high levels before aerobic exercise will not necessarily prevent hypoglycemia. At the other end of the panel, we see that, as with patients without diabetes, anaerobic exercise causes a spike in blood glucose, but because there's no insulin available or not enough insulin available, the glucose level can remain elevated. Why is there the difference between these 2 panels? Well, if you look at the aerobic exercise, we see that glucose uptake by the muscles and use by the muscles is in excess of that being provided by the blood. And that's caused by high ambient background levels of insulin, either quick-acting or long-acting insulin or basal insulin on a pump, combined with a impaired counter-regulatory hormone response to exercise that's seen in type 1 diabetes. Typically, the adrenaline and growth hormone responses are much reduced. The other panel of anaerobic exercise, we see a spike in glucose because the catecholamines and other hormones which are produced during exercise are not balanced out by endogenous insulin. Let's look at the middle 2 panels. So whether blood glucose falls or rises depends on the relative contribution to the fast, high-intensity exercise or the lower aerobic exercise. So think about a current sport like rugby, which we're just going through the World Cup. If you were playing in the forwards and you're running backwards and forwards across the field fairly constantly, you could expect, generally speaking, to have a falling blood glucose. But if you're in the playing on the wing and you were just doing intermittent runs at field goals, then you're going to have a rising blood glucose. And of course, if they happen to be that the amount of exercise is balanced, you'll have a blood glucose that doesn't change very much. Why is that? Well, this panel explains it quite nicely. So if we look at exercise where blood glucose doesn't change, we see that the ambient insulin level is appropriate for the exercise, and the counter-regulatory hormone response is producing enough hormones so as the glucose use and glucose uptake remains the same. So this would happen during mixed exercise where you have some aerobic and some anaerobic exercise balanced. The next panel, which is panel B, we see falling blood glucose. And as I discussed a minute ago, we can see that the glucose production by the liver is less than the glucose uptake by the muscles, so blood glucose falls. And then finally, exercise causing high glucose, we see the opposite. The counter-regulatory hormones produced by exercise produce a spike in hepatic glucose output, which is greater than muscle use, and so glucose levels rise. So, moving on to some recommendations and other factors which control blood glucose. This is a rather complicated table, but the first is recommendations to people with diabetes about their starting glucose. So we need to make sure that blood glucose is satisfactory to avoid hypoglycemia. If blood glucose is less than 5 millimoles, they should take between 10 and 20 grams of glucose before starting an exercise. If glucose is near target, 10 glucose is appropriate. If glucose is above target, aerobic exercise can be started, but anaerobic exercise may cause blood glucose to rise still further. Moving further down, if blood glucose are above target, then again anaerobic, so aerobic exercise can continue, but anaerobic exercise should perhaps be avoided as it will push blood sugar further. And then finally, if glucose are very high, people should take the opportunity of checking whether there's any ketones, and anaerobic exercise should not be performed. Although if those ketones are negative, then aerobic exercise is absolutely fine and no extra glucose is needed. There's more to this than just insulin. We need to think about other things. Carbohydrate intake, which will be very important. Typically, we're recommending for aerobic exercise 1 milligram per kilogram of glucose per hour of exercise, up to about 60 grams per hour. If the exercise is more prolonged than this, you can use more complicated carbohydrates. Other things can affect blood glucose. There can be discrepancy between self-monitoring glucose and the glucose values that continuous monitoring gives you. And we're all aware that all the devices have a lag in measuring interstitial glucose, and this is exacerbated to an extent by exercise where glucose levels fall rapidly. So people should look at the trend in glucose rather than the absolute glucose, as there may be a lag of 5 or 10 minutes. Other factors can affect blood glucose, such as medication and alcohol, physiological cycles, changes in work patterns, and intermittent stress and illness. So if people are finding problems with blood glucose, we need to think about other things than just exercise problems. So what tools can we use to help people with diabetes? Well, there's only really 2 or 3 things we've got available to us. The first is to change ambient insulin levels, but which insulin and by how much? The second is to give extra carbohydrate, and I've briefly discussed that. And then finally, we can stimulate the counter-regulatory hormone, which is an underused tool and very useful. So this is a very nice slide produced quite recently about what to do about basal rates. So optimally, exercise for people with type 1 diabetes should be done in the postprandial lobe, the preprandial lobe insulin level. That's the easiest to understand. So for the best time is probably first thing in the morning. The next best time is later in the afternoon. So in this study, what has happened is that the basal pump has been suspended at the start of the exercise, and that's the round symbols, and we can see that did not avoid hypoglycemia. Then the basal pump rates have been reduced by 50% and 80%, both 90 minutes before exercise, and both those have managed to avoid hypoglycemia. And so the amount of pump suspension is going to be on a trial and error basis for your patients, so they can work out how low the level should be. But certainly my first advice would be to reduce basal rates by 50% prior to exercise, and at least an hour and probably 90 minutes before exercise. What about other times? Well, if we walk through this panel here, we see that if the exercise is done immediately after eating, then the bolus dose should be reduced. And if the exercise is going to be done within 60 to 90 minutes of the quick-acting insulin, within the time frame of the rapid-acting insulin, I'd recommend a 50% reduction of the normal insulin to carbohydrate ratio. If the exercise is done in the pre-bolus dose, in the late postprandial phase or first thing in the morning, then basal dose reduction is useful. If somebody's on just basal insulin and the dose can't be reduced, say they're on Trasuba and the dose can't be reduced, all that can be recommended is adding extra carbohydrate. And then finally, we're recommending that the first meal after exercise, extra carbohydrates should be given. What about stimulating the counter-regulatory hormone system? Well, this can be done. The adrenal glands will respond to certain circumstances, and a maximum sprint of between 10 to 20 seconds immediately prior to exercise will stimulate the adrenal gland to produce a hormone response to exercise. And this is a very useful method of stopping or reducing the risk of hypoglycemia without taking extra carbohydrate. And I think this is a factor for unplanned exercise, but it's also useful for people who are trying to use their exercise as part of a weight control, because there's very little point in taking 30 grams of glucose, which is 120 calories, if you're trying to control your weight by exercise. It's very disheartening. So this is another useful tool. Now, the maximum sprint can be repeated after the end of the exercise if blood glucose is falling, and there is some evidence it can be done repeatedly during exercise to keep blood glucose up. So that's a very useful tool. Moving on to post-exercise problems. Many patients with type 1 diabetes notice that after exercise, irrespective of falling blood glucose during the exercise, that their blood glucose remains elevated or rises after exercise. And there's 2 or 3 reasons for that. The most obvious is that patients are over replacing with carbohydrate that's not absorbed during the exercise, but it's absorbed after the exercise is finished. But there are other factors. In aerobic exercise, if a lot of lactate is produced, this is converted into glucose, and that can add to rising blood glucose. And then finally, there's the effect of the counter-regulatory hormone response. Although this is reduced in type 1 diabetes, it is present and it continues to work after the exercise is finished. So you have unopposed gluconeogenesis induced by counter-regulatory hormones. And this is particularly the state after intense exercise. So in this study here, what they've done is done a bolus correction. And so they've used the same dose that they would use to bring their blood glucose down at other times. So they've recognized what the expected spike in blood glucose after exercise has been, and they've given the correction dose. And you can see this has worked very well, where people have given the full correction dose, blood glucose is returned to normal very rapidly. So that's another useful tool for your post-exercise hypoglycemia. What about other tools? Well, if patients or people with type 1 diabetes can change the sequencing of their exercise, this can also promote euglycemia. So in this panel, we see 2 lines. The first line, we see where patients, the dotted line, where people with diabetes have done the aerobic work first and then the resistance work secondly. And this is a very common pattern of exercise in the gym. And you can see that their blood glucose has fallen quite rapidly and has not risen to the same, has risen higher after the exercise. Where they did the resistance exercise first, there was a tendency for the blood glucose to fall less and then be lower after the exercise. So this could be very useful in conjunction with checking your blood glucose before you do the exercise. And this is where the devices such as the FreeStyle Libre really come into their own. So if you were going into the exercise and you found your blood glucose was a little bit higher, you could use your aerobic exercise first safely. But if you went into your exercise and it was low and you didn't want to take extra glucose, you could do the resistance exercise first. So when you're having your interview with your patient with diabetes or your person with type 1 diabetes, I'd like you to think of these things when you're planning your exercise. What sort of exercise is it? And do I think on balance the exercise is likely to go up or down? You won't always get it right, but it'll increase the probability of getting the right answer. Is there any possibility that I should change the order of my planned exercise to reduce the variation in blood glucose? How close is the exercise to the last meal injection? Will it be working? And if it is, should I anticipate by reducing the pre-exercise dose of insulin, or do I need to take extra carbohydrate to account for that? Can I adjust the insulin basal rate? Does it need to change? Is it too high for exercise? And the answer to that is it's almost certainly too high for doing aerobic exercise, and the reduction should be 50% at least 90 minutes before. Has there been, or have I had a hypoglycemic episode in the last 24 hours? If it's been self-corrected, it's safe to exercise, but if you've needed third-party assistance, you need to think very carefully about whether exercise is safe or possible, because exercise increases the likelihood of hypoglycemia, and the ability to recognize hypoglycemia is reduced after a severe hypoglycemic episode. And then finally, is my blood glucose satisfactory for performing the exercise? If you're going to be doing resistance exercise, or the patient can be doing resistance exercise, you can go into the piece of work with a slightly lower blood glucose than if you're doing aerobic exercise. All these factors are enormously helped by continuous monitoring, because you can get real-time feedback of how you're performing. Here's a summary of the pros and cons of each of the strategy. There's no right answer, different answers to be used on different days. So reducing pre-exercise bolus insulin reduces the risk of hypoglycemia during and following exercise, and reduce the need for carbohydrate, but it does require pre-planning, and it's not useful for spontaneous exercise. Reducing pre-exercise basal insulin may not be possible on a longer-acting insulin, but it might be possible on twice daily detamir or NPH or Humulin S insulin. Sorry, Humulin I insulin. Taking extra carbohydrate remains the mainstay, but has the disadvantage that it doesn't really help with weight control. The pre and post-exercise sprint is a useful tool to avoid having to take less carbohydrate, but the effect is rather limited and short-lived. Insulin pump therapy offers potential therapy to reduce the risk of hypoglycemia. And then finally, for patients and people with diabetes who are doing exercise relatively infrequently, they should reduce the nocturnal basal insulin dose by at least 10% after doing exercise to avoid hypoglycemia. I'm now going to hand over to Melanie.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction earlier. My name is Melanie Stevenson, and I've been an international level athlete, track athlete for the last 15 years. In recent times, I've also become a youth coach. I have type 1 diabetes myself and have been on an insulin pump for 10 years out of the 18 I've had the condition. I'm also a diabetes, lifestyle and sports blogger and vlogger. And last year I was fortunate that my blog was named the top online for sport and type 1 diabetes. So a little bit about what I'd like to talk to you about today. I'll give you a bit more of a brief background about the sport that I do and how that interacts with using the FreeStyle Libre system. I'll talk a little bit about nutrition and monitoring as well, and about patient empowerment. I'll conclude, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So my sports are the 100, 200 meter sprints and relays. And in the past, I've been a record holder and also a Welsh champion. I've had over 25 caps for my country and 2 captaincies as well. And the captaincies have meant an awful lot to me as a person with diabetes, because it showed that regardless of having the condition, I was still kind of completely capable of leading my team. And it wasn't about having diabetes, it was about being a sports person. And that was the main kind of message there. And then also a 4 times British University Championship medalist. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that kind of competition, it's every university almost in the UK puts athletes forward to do kind of track and other events, but obviously my event is track. And we all compete against each other, all abilities. So you might have people who've never done athletics before, and also people who've been to the Olympics that you're racing against as well. But the reason that I bring it up, and if you kind of have a look at the picture on the right-hand side, is that the medal that was won there was in the 4x200 meter relay. And 2 of us out of the 4 relay runners had type 1 diabetes, which is absolutely incredible, because when I started the sport, you know, all those years ago, I didn't know anybody else with diabetes that was trying to do elite level sport. So I think that people with diabetes are becoming much more prevalent on the sporting field, which is fantastic to see. And a little bit about my diagnosis and how I found kind of doing physical activity in the first place. I was diagnosed back in 2001. All of the typical symptoms. So I'd lost about 2 stone in weight. I was incredibly thirsty all the time, kind of waking up at night to try and get a drink. So I was incredibly tired, of course, and going to the toilet really frequently as well. So the 40s of diabetes. And was in high school at the time. I was 13, and I didn't know what was going on, but my mum knew there was something wrong. So we got ourselves to the doctor. They did a urine test, saw things weren't right, and recommended that I went to the hospital. And I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, in for a few hours, and then discharged the same night. My diabetes nurses came to visit me the next day and kind of started me on a journey of understanding my diabetes with regards to my injections, with regards to the role of carbohydrates in managing my diabetes as well. But one of the huge things that they also did was that they went into my school and spoke to my teachers and kind of highlighted to them that having type 1 diabetes was no reason to exclude me from any kind of physical activity, any school trips that were going on, any competitions. And it was with that my school, sorry, the slides jumped there. It was with that my school then encouraged me to go to the school's competition, and I discovered my passion for athletics. Oh, there we are. I found from the very beginning that I enjoyed it. I wasn't very good at it at the beginning, but that really didn't matter at the start because I just enjoyed it. And I noticed that it started to have a huge impact on my diabetes as well. It had an impact on my blood glucose levels, for example, but also my confidence. So falling in love with the sport almost from the beginning, I got myself a coach and started to take it a little bit more seriously. But I really can't thank my pediatric diabetes team enough, because even though I was frightened at diagnosis and I didn't know anybody else with the condition, I didn't know what was going on in that respect, I didn't feel a huge amount of trauma because they really kind of empowered me with knowledge and the tools that I needed to manage my condition. And when I came to them 3 years later, because I didn't take up athletics until 3 years after I was diagnosed, when I came to them 3 years later and said, oh, I'd quite like to do this athletics and train a little bit more frequently, they just asked me, okay, then how will we work this out? They didn't say no, and I didn't need to ask for permission. They were just willing to work with me to make sure that I could do it. And my parental support was incredibly important as well. That my parents had exactly the same attitude, that yes, they were probably a little bit frightened about what it was going to be like to manage my diabetes with having and doing sport. They still encouraged me all the way. And so it was the diabetes nurses, the dietitians, the diabetes specialist consultant as well, that all helped me get onto the podium. I don't think I did it by myself. So the benefits of sport that I was talking about that I discovered from the very beginning was that I was an athlete first and then also a person with type 1 diabetes, but type 1 diabetes wasn't the label that I was running with, if you'll excuse the pun. And I found that the harder I worked, I saw my blood glucose level control kind of respond to that as well, and positives come from that. I found that whilst it could be difficult because I needed to know about diet and what my blood glucose levels were doing, and my competitors didn't necessarily. I found that that knowledge gave me a little bit of an edge, I suppose, that I was thinking about those things and making those considerations, because in sprinting we're always looking to reduce our times. So if knowledge can kind of help with that, then so much the better. And I knew as well myself that it wasn't an easy journey, kind of metaphorically speaking, to get to the track, because I knew that I had to manage my nutrition, I had to manage my blood glucose levels. But then that made it all the more kind of, I don't know, it just kind of gave a greater sense of achievement, even getting to the track, because I knew how hard I'd had to work on my diabetes and my training. And it was a sense of community as well, to be part of the athletics community and to be able to challenge the stereotypes that are sometimes unfortunately associated with having the condition. But perhaps most importantly, it was fun as well. So with all of this fun and all of the positives of kind of managing diabetes and doing sport, why is technology even needed? Well, it would be kind of irresponsible for me to kind of neglect the fact that, yes, there is an increased hypo risk when you are doing sport. And the risk can be quite long lasting, that it can seem that there's, you know, you kind of really need to look after your blood glucose levels, of course, whilst you're doing sport. But the impact of the sport can also last for the hours afterwards, as Dr. Gannon was saying. So you still need to consider what's going on hours after, and sometimes into the next day when you're training really regularly. And sometimes with the intensity of the sport that I do, it can cause a little bit of variation in insulin delivery. It can also cause adrenaline spikes, particularly during competitions, which is something that I think I'm still trying to learn about. And it does require more monitoring, because more information is more knowledge and is key. And sometimes there can be a lack of understanding amongst other athletes, perhaps, or amongst officials when they see me getting my insulin pump out or pricking my finger, or when I used to do injections as well. There might be questions around what I was doing. And unfortunately as well, in the past, I've been asked by my healthcare professionals years ago whether sport was really essential to me. And my answer was, at the time, I'd already kind of got my first international cap. And my response was, yes, I understand that I need to do it safely, but sport and kind of living my life the way that I'd like to with my diabetes is essential to me. So to give you a snapshot of what training and racing was like before I started using the FreeStyle Libre system, it involved very frequent blood glucose checks. To give you a rough idea, that would be, say, doing a finger prick before breakfast when I wake up in the morning, might mean another one afterwards, mid-morning time. It'll certainly mean another finger prick before lunch. Mid-afternoon time, I do another one. When I was training at 6, I'd probably do another one at about 4:30 in case I needed a snack. I do another blood glucose check before starting training to make sure I was safe to train. I might do another one during training. I'd certainly do one after training to be able to drive home from the track. And then I'd also do another one before tea and before bed. So as you can imagine, I had quite sore fingers as well. And I was probably doing so many blood glucose checks because I needed the information. But what it was providing was a picture or a snapshot in time, rather than that kind of constant video of what's going on. And I wanted to be able to kind of predict what was going on, but there was an element of unpredictability, unfortunately. And I very much felt that my diabetes was kind of managed alone when I was at the track, because only I could prick my finger. And nighttime blood glucose checks were kind of, I did them before I went to bed. But then I was kind of in the dark, if you will, about what was going on overnight, unless I was up finger pricking then as well. So there was an element of hope involved, unfortunately. And it hasn't always been an easy ride for me with diabetes and sport, because unfortunately in 2008, I found that I started becoming quite insulin resistant. I was on injections back then. I'd been on injections for 7 or so years, and I should have been on about 4 a day, but I was finding that my blood glucose levels just weren't behaving the way that I needed them to, particularly with the amount of sport that I was doing. And so kind of sitting down with my healthcare professionals, we kind of came to realize that an insulin pump was really one of the best options for me. But because I was so physically active, it took quite a while, and there was quite a long transition from from injections to being on an insulin pump. And quite honestly, we had the conversation where we didn't know whether that was going to be the end of my athletic career, because there wasn't anybody else that we knew of that we could find at the time that was on an insulin pump and that was doing elite level sport, which was absolutely devastating to me because health is everything. However, so was athletics, just meant the world to me as well. So it really was a very, very difficult time and a very difficult decision, in addition to not feeling very well. But it really showed me how resilient I could actually be, even more so than I knew. And it also showed me about the potential role of technology in diabetes and sport. And as I say, it was a very difficult time because diabetes is not just a physical condition, in my opinion. It also affects our mental health as well. But I would say, looking back now, that I'm thankful for my struggle, because without it, I wouldn't have found my strength. And as I say, that's where I really kind of started to understand the psychological side of diabetes. And it was a few years later after that that it inspired me to start a support group to have for people, you know, whether they did sport or not, regardless of that, but to create a space for people with diabetes to be able to talk about having the condition. But what doesn't beat you does make you stronger. And I was very fortunate that we worked hard, myself and the hospital team and my parents, and I did get back to athletics. And within a couple of years, I was kind of, about 10 weeks or so, I was starting to kind of get back into training, starting to work things out, and then built up to competitions again. And I was fortunate in 2012 that I was given my own sports campaign, which was called Find Your Greatness, with one of the biggest sporting brands in the world. And the campaign was about ordinary people doing not so ordinary things. And this picture is not the best example, but some of the pictures in the campaign, which took over every Olympic venue in London and the sporting brand's social media as well, had my insulin pump. I had my insulin pump on, pictured running, because there was no... The aim of the campaign was to show that even if you do have challenges, whether they be diabetes or anything else, then you still, with a positive attitude, it should still be possible for you to achieve what you'd like to. And also in that same year, during the Olympics, just before the Olympics, I was nominated by Diabetes UK to carry the Olympic torch. And I carried it in front of 20,000 people on the main stage in Cardiff, my hometown. And it was the most incredible experience because it gave me a platform to show people, not just with diabetes, but those without the condition as well, that people with diabetes can still achieve their sporting dreams, or be they otherwise dreams, that it is still possible. Yes, it is a little bit more challenging for us sometimes, and there are really difficult days within that, but that it is still possible. And it was a bit of a double-edged sword in that time as well, because I got to meet a lot of people with diabetes and people without. I kind of took the Olympic torch around schools and athletics clubs so people could hold it and see it. And unfortunately, there were quite a few people with diabetes at the time who said to me that I didn't know that you could still kind of achieve in sport with having type 1, which made me incredibly sad, because I would hope that they felt empowered to do so, but I also hope that things have started to change from here on out as well. So a bit more about diabetes management and sport with the FreeStyle Libre system. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with the system, but if you're not, I just wanted to briefly describe that it's a small sensor, roughly about the size of a £2 coin, that's worn on the back of the upper arm. You can swipe it with a handheld device or the mobile phone device to get glucose readings, and it'll be able to show trend arrows and data, which, as I've said to you before, is incredibly important when you're looking for optimal performance. And one of the things that appealed to me almost from the very beginning is how discreet it is as well. But before I actually got the chance all those years ago to try the FreeStyle Libre system, I had quite a few questions because, as I say, I am very focused on my sport and performance. And I wanted to know how the Libre was going to kind of respond to my sport? So these were some of the questions that I had, and I thought you might find it helpful if I kind of noted them down and spoke a little bit about them. So the first question I had was, will the FreeStyle Libre system stay on when I do sport? And my experience has been that it does. I find it quite streamlined, and I find the adhesive sticky as well. So even though I'm really putting it through its paces, it kind of, yeah, I haven't had any problems with that. And I was really worried about whether I'd be able to feel it when I was doing sport, because obviously sprinting is quite it's a high impact sport. It's really high intensity, and I thought, oh gosh, if I can feel it when I'm kind of running, that's really going to be off putting. But no, I forget that I'm wearing it truthfully. I also wondered whether it would suit my body type, because as sprinters we tend to be kind of lean. We do a lot of weightlifting and a lot of high intensity work, as I've said. But again, absolutely fine as long as it's worn in the appropriate place. And the question I probably get asked the most is whether it's accurate when I'm doing sport. And I find that it is. The nature of sprinting is that you'll go off and do a sprint and you'll come back. And even with that kind of back and forth activity, I do find that it is accurate. So to tell you a little bit more about the type of training that I do and what the FreeStyle Libre system has told me in terms of feedback of how my glucose levels respond. So we do things like sand dune training, which is incredibly high intensity. And I find that because we train in the morning, my glucose levels steadily kind of decrease and go down. Whereas on the track, the intensity is probably that little bit higher, and that I find that my glucose levels drop quite quickly if I'm not prepared and I haven't planned ahead. Whereas with weights, which was probably a bit of a mystery really before as to how they kind of behaved, I find that they steadily increase the longer that I'm lifting. And I also find that my glucose levels tend to follow that trend as well. And when I talked about putting the FreeStyle Libre system through its paces, this is how I do it with the volume of training that I do. So Mondays can be quite long sessions, speed endurance, but Tuesdays will be Olympic weightlifting, so really vigorous weights. Wednesdays are circuit training sessions, so they can be hot, sweaty sessions. Thursday, we're back on track. Friday, it's circuits and it's core again. On Saturday, active recovery, which can still be quite difficult in terms of blood glucose management because of that continuous nature of, it's just a very kind of relaxed session. It might involve, say, going for a walk or just kind of, you know, keeping active, but it can be difficult to manage. And then the sand dunes are the activity on a Sunday morning. And so to give you the other side of the picture of using the FreeStyle Libre system for sport, what I found is that it's brought back what I wanted in terms of predictability and planning, because I've had more data and information that I've gained from it. So with that information, it enables me then to take action. So whether that's thinking about my basal levels before training, for example, or whether I want to take my carbohydrates on board. And it's also given my coach confidence as well, because one of my coaches is my dad and my other coach has been with me from the beginning. And so I've been able to really easily teach them how to use the reader or to kind of use my phone device as well and share information. So they feel confident that if anything should happen in training, if I was, for example, not able to do it myself because I'm really tired, then they're able to help me out with that. And my fingers are quite a bit happier as well, that I'm doing less finger pricks than I needed to do before, but I am still checking when I'm going, if I think I'm going low or if I'm going particularly high. And the discretion, as I've mentioned, is something that's really beneficial, I think, because I can just swipe, think about what I'm going to do, but nobody else on the track is really aware unless I tell them what I'm doing. And it's helped with the increased monitoring as well. And the freedom and safety that I've noticed the people around me feel a lot more confident, such as my husband, for example. Similarly to my coaches, he's really kind of taken this on board and wanted to know how the FreeStyle Libre system worked, and that's improved his confidence too. And in the picture on the right hand side, you can see that I was, well, you can't see the Libra, but I climbed Snowdon last year with it, and it was really handy to have because the weather conditions changed quite a lot as you made it to the summit. So being able to swipe as I went was incredibly helpful. And I'm also able to use a FreeStyle Libre system around my nutrition, which is quite an important part of being an athlete. So I can record what carbohydrates or the value of carbohydrates that I'm having, my glucose levels and insulin and exercise within the reader or on the phone. I can add notes as well, which is really helpful. Reminders can be quite helpful as well if you've got I've got a particularly busy day with training, and recognizing those trends and spikes with the daily patterns is essential for kind of fine-tuning my glucose management and kind of looking at how the trend arrows are behaving to see kind of where my diabetes or my glucose levels might be going. I particularly like time and target because I think that's something that helps me keep my A1C in range, because I find that the longer I can stay time and target where able, then that's how my A1C comes out at the better results. But even with kind of all the tools that we have at our disposal, with diabetes, one size does not fit all because we're all such individual people. What works for me with my diabetes might not work for you. So this is the kind of thing that I tend to think about, because there's no kind of prescriptive approach necessarily, and it's not for me to kind of give advice, but the things that I think about when I'm preparing for sport with my diabetes is that I think big about sport and diabetes. So I think about my glucose levels, what are they doing, where are they going, and what do I need to do to kind of help balance that out. I think about my insulin, and I think about my insulin on board because that could be a potential factor towards hypoglycemia, and also my glucose. So carrying glucose with me at the athletics track, letting people know where that supply is, and also thinking about my glucose and my carbohydrate all through the day, preparing for training to make sure that I've got the fuel to help me with my performance. But as I've mentioned before, I've been on the FreeStyle Libre system from almost the beginning. But this is an example of that it is quite an easy system to use. And this is an example of the diabetes community coming together to achieve in sport. That last year in 2018, there were 70 runners that kind of were brought together by my friend Paul, who wanted to kind of show that diabetes didn't need to stop us. So we decided to run a half marathon together. Now, as you know, I'm a sprinter, and that's a completely different sport to what I'm aware of, what I'm comfortable with. But I couldn't let this opportunity kind of pass me by. I wanted to be part of this world record attempt. And we were all or many of us were part of a study so that we could further the research of how our bodies behave with diabetes in sport. And so to capture the data, many of us were wearing the FreeStyle Libre system for training and also on the day as well. And as I mentioned, some people were really experienced at running half marathons, and some of us were absolute first timers. But we used the FreeStyle Libre system and things like training diaries and other tools to try and help us kind of plan our run, really. So over the 13 miles, it was 22, 24 degrees sunshine, and it was incredibly warm and incredibly difficult. But every single one of us crossed the finish line safely, which was no mean feat, as I say, with the weather that we had. And it was through good diabetes management and planning that I think we achieved that. And so just kind of coming to the end of my presentation, just want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts, really. That quite often healthcare professionals can say to us that they want us to become more physically active, or we might say that ourselves. And it's really important that we have a successful sporting experience, because as Dr. Gallen said, it can be really frightening if glucose levels are dropping overnight or that they're dropping before or during. And I believe that it's things like information and technology that can help us bridge the gap between the two, because it can help inform and empower us in terms of our diabetes behavior and how it responds to exercise. And a lot of the kind of skills and the characteristics that sporting success requires, I would say, are also the things that I've learned through diabetes. I've had to learn to be disciplined. I've had to learn resilience, as I've mentioned, to be determined, to have a positive attitude. And so my message would be for anybody looking to kind of, if you're not already doing physical activity and you're kind of not sure whether it's going to be for you, have confidence in the fact that diabetes gives us a lot of skills that you might not realize that you have, but that are really good for sporting success. And to leave you with this quote from Jesse Owens, the Olympian: "The battles that count aren't the ones for gold medals. Actually, the struggle is within yourself. The invisible, inevitable battles. That's where it's at." As I mentioned, even though I love athletics and I love being physically active, diabetes management also spans outside of that. And I decided to wear the FreeStyle Libre system on my wedding day because I didn't want diabetes to stop me from having the best day of my life. And so I used that to be able to kind of manage my diabetes in the background, along with my insulin pump and my CGM there, so that I could just get on with living a normal life despite having type 1 diabetes. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mel and Dr. Gallen, for going through your slides. I thought they were really informative, and I hope everyone felt the same. The first question we've had in tonight is, what do you recommend eating and drinking if your blood sugar is dropping rapidly during a long distance run?
The only thing that will raise blood glucose rapidly is glucose tablets or glucose containing drinks. So we're quite sloppy about calling things sugar and glucose, but blood glucose is only glucose. If you take carbohydrates or even sugary containing drinks, they have to be digested and take a bit longer. So if your blood glucose is falling rapidly, it has to be glucose in some form. And you can buy that as powdered glucose sports drinks, and you make up a 10% solution. That's 100 grams in a litre. Or you take 3 dextrosol tablets, which is 10 grams, or 2 jelly babies, which is 8 grams. And typically 6 dextrosol tablets or 4 to 6 jelly babies or 200 mils of a 10% solution will raise blood glucose. If you have more complicated carbohydrate, like cakes and biscuits and snacks, flapjacks, things like that, that won't push your blood sugar up while you're doing the piece of work and avoid hypoglycemia, but it'll add to rising blood glucose when you finish the exercise.
Great, thank you, Ian.
Can I just there's been a whole series of questions come through which I haven't been able to answer, but I want to go through them, just a couple of things which link the ideas together. The first is an apology. Due to the limited amount of time, I've tried to condense the ideas as much as possible, and some of the people have written in saying that I've not explained it very well, which is probably true. So the first thing is the difference between aerobic and anaerobic exercise, for particularly people who miss the start. So aerobic exercise means that all the fuel is burnt completely to carbon dioxide and water, so you can carry on working almost indefinitely. So that's exercise you can do while you're still talking, and it's typically things like jogging, running, cycling, and that sort of exercise almost invariably makes blood glucose fall in people with diabetes. The other extreme is anaerobic exercise. So this is short, intense exercise where the glucose is not converted completely and you produce lactate, and that makes you feel sick and unwell. So it's short, intense exercise, and that's associated with a rising blood glucose. The next couple of ideas was about prandial and postprandial. I'm sorry about that. I should have spoke more English. Prandial means meal. So if the exercise is done immediately after a meal, you've got the effect of the quick-acting insulin dose you've given with the meal and the long-acting dose, and that's unpredictable. So it's best to do the exercise before you've eaten, or before you've had the quick-acting dose. If you're going to do the exercise after you've done your exercise and it's aerobic, I'd recommend you reduce the dose by at least 50%, and that would mean either doubling your normal insulin to carbohydrate ratio or giving half of your normal ratio. And then the final thing that I've read a lot about is concerns about discrepancy between the FreeStyle Libre and blood tests. So the first thing to say is that the blood tests of themselves may not be accurate. Some of the machines are not particularly accurate in themselves. The second is they're measuring different things. So the FreeStyle Libre is measuring interstitial glucose, which is glucose under the skin, and this lags behind blood glucose. The amount of time varies for individuals, but it's typically 10 minutes, perhaps a little bit longer. That lag becomes quite important when blood glucose is falling very rapidly after exercise. So if you notice that you think it's getting less accurate after exercise, it's not. It's just the gap is more pronounced, and you can still use the trends, so the upward arrows or the downward arrows usefully, although you should rely on your the device. If the arrows are dropping rapidly, it means that your blood glucose is even lower than you think it's going to be. So I hope I've dealt with quite a few questions that people have raised, but that I've been reading.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that. A lot of people are also asking about what sort of level do you recommend people start exercising on?
Yeah, so that's in one of the slides. It was rather small font on it, but it depends on what the exercise is going to be. So if it's aerobic exercise, that's exercise where you think your blood glucose is going to fall, then you need it somewhere between 7 and 9, perhaps a bit 7 and 10. If it's a sprint exercise where your blood glucose is going to rise, you can have it a bit lower, perhaps 6 to 7 when you're before you go in. Or perhaps even a bit lower if you find your blood sugar rises. Some people notice, particularly intense exercise like a cycle sprint class, the blood glucose can go up 5 or 6 millimoles. So you could actually go into your glucose being quite a lot lower. You'll have to use your experience of what your glucose does during that exercise, and that's again another thing where the FreeStyle Libre really comes into an advantage.
Great, thank you for that, Ian. And another question that we're again getting quite a lot of is about carbohydrate loading prior to exercise.
Yeah, so this is very popular in athletes. The people are said to carb load before long distance work, and whatever the evidence for the use of that outside of diabetes, the evidence in diabetes that should not happen. The extra carbohydrate that's required should be balanced out through the whole week and added to the existing meals, not all taken immediately prior to the piece of work you're doing. We've got evidence that giving a carb load before doing a marathon or other intense exercise just adds to blood glucose disturbance and makes the performance worse. So if you need to take extra food, say you're of normal weight and you're not trying to lose weight, and you're having to increase your energy intake, I would add the extra food evenly throughout the week with all your meals, and take the high dose of quick-acting insulin to cope with that.
And Mel, on that question about the food that you eat prior to exercising, what do you tend to have as part of your diet before you've got a big competition coming?
So generally speaking, the way I kind of think about carbohydrates is that I think about them from the very start of the day. For example, if I'm training, so I'm thinking about what carbohydrates that I'm having, and what protein I'm having. Sorry, my browse disappeared. Before training, for breakfast, I'm thinking about my mid-morning snacks. So I'm thinking about things that are not going to cause a glucose spike. And then I'm thinking about having a balanced lunch as well, and having a snack prior to training at that 4:30 point that I mentioned previously. But on competition days, I try and practice the nutrition that I'm having, so I don't have anything new on a competition day because of that element of predictability and wanting to kind of go with that. And I am somebody that does have regular snacks and meals throughout a competition because, of course, carbohydrates provide energy as you're doing physical activity. And thinking about having a meal to replace the carbohydrates and the muscle glycogen that I've used up after exercise and after a competition as well.
Great, thanks for that, Mel. Another question that we've had quite a lot of is the struggling after exercise. So a lot of people find that their blood glucose is very high after they've exercised. How can they help to stop that kind of big peak?
Yeah, so that's a problem that people complain about all the time, and I explained in my talk that it's got 3 components. It may be replacing with the wrong sort of carbohydrate during exercise, so that you're digesting what you've eaten. So if you've been eating something like a flapjack or a banana, and the exercise is under 40 minutes, that's going to be absorbed when you finish the exercise. The second is that the hormone response to exercise raises blood glucose, and the third is that lactate levels are increased. So the tactics for this is you can do a cool down rather than take extra insulin. You can do a jog or a lower piece of work for 10 to 15 minutes, which will bring your blood glucose down. The glucose will be taken up into the muscles. The second is that if you're finding you're getting a spike of glucose after exercise reliably, then you can correct that with a bolus dose of insulin at the same correction dose as you would normally rise. So say your normal correction dose was 1 unit of insulin would bring it down by 3 millimoles, which would be not unusual, and you've seen your blood glucose spike after exercise from 8 to 14, you could give yourself 2 units of insulin. But remember that insulin will still be on board to an extent prior to the next meal, so that there may need to be a dose adjustment before the next meal too, particularly if you're on a pump.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, even though we have so many questions come in this evening, we've run out of time. A lot of people have asked if the slides would be made available and if the presentation will be on demand. Unfortunately, we are unable to make the slides available. However, the presentation will be available on demand in the next couple of days. We will send out a link to everyone who is registered for the webinar of where you can find the webinar hosted. I really like to thank Dr. Ian Gallen and Mel Stevenson for their time today. I found it very informative, and I hope everyone else has too. I hope you have a good evening, and we will see you on the next webinar.